Okay. Welcome to World Affairs Friday. The program is sponsored by the Peoria Area World Affairs Council from our office on the campus at Bradley. World Affairs Friday events, as you probably know, feature a wide variety of experts and academics who discuss global issues and how they affect us here in Central Illinois. This program is being recorded, so you are welcome to turn off your camera if you wish. Please mute yourself at this time so there's no interference with our wonderful speaker. You are invited to submit questions to the chat, and I will moderate them in the second half of the program. It is my pleasure to introduce Angela Weck today. She is, of course, a member of the faculty of the Department of History and the Institute of International Studies at Bradley. Most of you know her as the executive director of PAWAC. She earned a master's degree in Russian and East European studies from the University of Minnesota and is a real expert on Russia. She teaches Russian history at Bradley and is a frequent leader of OLLI courses. We are very lucky to have her here to speak about this important moment in history. Angela, your turn.
Thanks, Barb. Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen here and make sure that everybody can see it quick before I get started. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about the upcoming Biden-Putin summit. And let's just get started. So if I can. So as we know, our own president spoke when he arrived in Cornwall to meet with our allies in Europe, and he made a big pronouncement that he will let Mr. Putin know what he wants him to know. And that drew a large cheer from the military crowd that was watching him. He has frequently said, the United States is back. It is important to remember that President Biden is not President Trump. They are different styles, they are different experiences, they are different methods of approaching foreign policy for the United States. The meeting that will occur between President Biden and Putin will be fresh on the heels of this G7 meeting that's going on now, trying to get the global economic platform of the top 7 economies of the world back on good standing after this pandemic. It is not the G8. The G8 would include Russia, and so Russia is not at the G7 discussions. Next week, the members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Collective Security Arrangement, will also be meeting. Their summit is called NATO 2030, and it will talk about the future of that collective security arrangement. And again, Russia is not part of that. And so the key approach that Biden is using is restoring traditional alliances with our friends in Europe and with others around the world. It's really important to note that Biden is not a foreign policy rookie. However, it's also important to note that neither is Putin. So when Putin met with President Obama, it was clear that Obama was not prepared. When he met with President Trump, it was clear that President Trump was not prepared. Biden at least presents an image that he is prepared, but we'll see. Okay, I'm not sure why that occurred, but let me try that one more time. Sorry about that. Rather strange. Okay, how about that? So can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the top 5 issues that President Biden would like to address with President Putin, in my estimation at least. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Are cyber attacks, election interference, civil and human rights, military activities, and sanctions. let's take a look at those. So first, cybersecurity. And as we have seen, even as recently as just a couple days ago, there have been a number of recent hacks that are quite concerning. The SolarWinds and the Microsoft hack probably went on for a little better than a year before it was detected. The general consensus is that they weren't trying to do anything like, blow anything up or anything like that, but they did want to see what we know, and saw what we know for more than a year. Other attacks are more of the traditional one. If you look on the screen, you can see this USAID. Don't open emails from anybody you don't know. But of course, this came through the intergovernmental channels. And so people opened it because it says view documents. And that was a way that they injected a worm into the government systems. The Colonial Pipeline was hacked by an organization called DarkSide, which has deep ties to the Russian government, as did the JBS, the beef processing, one of the largest meat processing organizations in the United States. There is growing concern that these are not just private entities hacking and getting ransomware, but these are private entities that are fully supported and perhaps even funded by the best and brightest, the Foreign Intelligence Service in Russia, or the military intelligence, the GRU. The FSB is their security in general. They're the former KGB. So we have seen some of these organizations, the Dark Side, Cozy Bear, Revo, lots of other ones. We know that they have ties to Russia, but what do we do about it? In the recent attempt, or in the recent hack, the US was already looking at Dark Side, and so they were able to take back some of the Bitcoin that had been paid as a ransom. But is that going to be enough? This is kind of weird. So that's what the United States wants as far as cybersecurity for Biden. This is what Putin's response is going to be. So he has plausible deniability. When President Trump was there just a couple of years ago, President Trump agreed that it couldn't be Russia. Why would it be Russia? Putin will argue he can't control private groups any more than Biden can control private groups in the United States. And tit for tat, the United States has also committed cyber attacks. Let's just take a look at the attack on the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran. One of the suggestions from a couple years ago is, why don't we just share our cyber information, and then we'll know the best way to protect each other from cyber attacks. So said the fox to the hens. Election interference is another big issue for Biden. There were a lot of rumors that outside forces were interrupting our electoral process. We've all heard the, cacophony of complaints that the Dominion voting system was taken to Venezuela or somewhere else and votes were injected. Rumors have a great deal of weight when people believe them. And so promoting those rumors can be disruptive and has been disruptive. Social media influences. With great irony, Russian groups take both pro and con sides. The whole purpose is to divide the people of the United States and have us fighting against each other. We're less likely to pay attention to what they're doing because we're more embroiled in our own electoral problems. And that's a problem. We don't do that to other states. And then there's also the electoral fraud that occurs in Russia. The pictures at the bottom there are the voting last year during the pandemic for the proposed constitutional changes, the most notable of which zeroed out Putin's terms and allows him to run for 2 more terms. These are a couple of the funnier pictures I found. Children's playgrounds, this tree stump, cement benches sitting out front of apartment complexes in order to get people to vote and maintain social distancing. So the picture on the bottom is a very popular hiking trail in the woods, and they set up a table and collected votes from people as they walked by. So is it all above board and legitimate? There's some real irregularities, and the overall percentage of people who voted for those constitutional amendments was also quite low. But again, what will Putin come back with? The United States has interfered in their elections time and again. I can almost guarantee you that Putin will bring up 2011 and his complaints that Hillary Clinton and McFaul, the ambassador at the time, supported the protesters. There's no way that those protests could have been domestically generated. People love Putin. And so all of those protests are from outside agitators. And he really likes to beat on Hillary Clinton for that. He has also promoted, in fact, just a couple days ago, his courts have declared a number of political organizations to be anti-government, which is in our equivalent terrorist. And so anybody who is anti-government can be arrested, can lose their jobs. But nonetheless, I'm going to come back to that in a second. But what Putin complains about is that all of these organizations within Russia who have complaints against the government are funded by outside sources. And then the other argument that Putin will make is that just look at the riots in your own country over the presidential election and the continuing challenges to that election. For Putin, that clearly demonstrates a weakness to democracy. What I had started to talk about was the treatment of political entities of all sorts. Protesters are quite commonplace. The middle picture, by the way, if any of you had the opportunity to look at Putin's palace, the great expose by Alexei Navalny about the huge compound that's down on the Black Sea. When that came out, shortly after Navalny's arrest, people turned out in droves with golden toilet brushes to demonstrate that they think that Putin is corrupt, that he's spending their money on his own needs and wants. Protesters have been beaten, rounded up, detained. If you even show up at a protest and are detained, you spend 15 days in jail minimum. That's even if you were like standing on the street watching and they pulled you into a van, you spend 15 days in jail. Others will go for much longer. The beatings and abuse of some of the protesters while they're in custody has been quite horrific and widely noted. Assassinations, Boris Nemtsov, a former friend of Putin who was threatening to run against him, was assassinated virtually outside of the Kremlin. And of course, the most famous is Alexei Navalny in the top picture. He is still in prison now. And more importantly, as I was talking about before, all of his organizations, any of those related to him, have been declared to be anti-government. And so all of those people are terrorists. And what Russia's government has done is noted every person who liked the post, who viewed that video of Putin's palace, who commented, who showed up at a protest. They can lose their jobs and be jailed. And so for Biden, he will definitely bring up this rise in authoritarianism. The bottom picture, this is across Russia. The bottom picture is of Sergei Fodorov, who is over in Khabarovsk in the Far East. So it's not just Moscow and St. Petersburg, it's the entire country. In response, Putin will say, look at your own protests. On January 6th, you have political protests as well. There are documented cases of abuse of people of color by the police. The Black Lives Matter protests, those people were beaten. The rioting and the destruction that occurred is quite healthy, not healthy, but widespread. And that the way Russia treats its political parties and the anti-government groups is Russia's business. This is domestic matter, just as the United States should deal with its own political situation. Russia can deal with Russia's own political situation. Remember, the constitutional changes allow him to stay in power until 2036. The terms that I've put there, the corporatist and the personalist, are the political science side of me. The corporatist is based on the in system and the out of system. Also tied to the acceptable political parties and the anti-government parties. The problem is who's deciding those. For Putin, of course, the government should be deciding which political parties and political entities are acceptable and which ones are not, just as the United States does. The personalist is tied to the personality and the life of Vladimir Putin. If he was to get hit by a bus tomorrow, the system would have a serious problem. But what is argued is that he is popular enough. He's at one of his lowest popularity ratings now, about 60%. When's the last time a US president hit 60%? It was after 9/11, shortly after 9/11, and we haven't seen it since. So he rises depending on what happens domestically. And so as far as Putin is concerned, he's doing it right because the people love him. And he will definitely school Biden with look to your own house. He has mentioned that many, many times. Military actions will also be Biden's, one of Biden's issues. The overreach of Russia into its neighborhood. The Luhansk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine are still seeing violence. The seizure of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea is a problem. But there are frozen conflicts elsewhere in Transnistria, in Abkhazia, South Ossetia. The recent challenges between Armenia and Azerbaijan are exacerbated by Russia. And Russia could do something to resolve that and essentially sold the Armenians out after protecting them for some time. For Biden, he will also point out that Putin has aligned himself with some of the worst actors in the world. Bashar al-Assad in Syria on the right, and Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. A couple weeks ago, when Belarus forced down a jet in order to take a journalist off the plane, a pretty significant effort. Yet we didn't do anything because he had Russia's support. As far as Putin is concerned, the United States has a long history of interfering in the sovereign affairs of states. Virtually every continent, all kinds of countries. So, don't point any fingers. The United States is trying to force Russia's hand in its own neighborhood. The expansion of NATO is a problem. And why is the United States even worried about Ukraine? This is Russia's neighbor, and Russia will take care of Ukraine. As far as Putin is concerned, the United States is the single biggest threat to world peace. And the United States actions outside of its borders. Biden will also talk about sanctions. And sanctions are a controversial tactic, but they're not likely to go anywhere. The sanctions, this is from The Economist actually, and it shows where sanctions had the greatest effect on Russia were right after they were implemented. But since then, the Russian economy has rebounded. So nonetheless, for Biden, he will not lift sanctions unless there are dramatic changes. He has threatened to impose new sanctions and to work with these rebuilding alliances to make the sanctions even more harsh. And Biden has said that no options are off the table. For Putin, Russia's learned to live with sanctions for a long time now. What they prove is that the United States toolbox is empty and they don't have anything else to do. They've gotten around the sanctions, and it is unlikely that the United States, and for that matter, Russia, will do anything else. We're both nuclear powers, and Putin is keenly aware of that. So, in other words, I think that the Biden-Putin summit Biden will let Putin know what he wants, and Putin will let Biden know what he wants. There is a common thread in the United States, in the State Department and Department of Defense, that Russia is a diminished power. Putin will demonstrate that that is wrong thinking. And there's a lot of reasons that that is, in fact, wrong thinking. They are not as powerful as the United States, but they are also not to be dismissed. They get a huge chunk of their budget from gas and oil, but production costs in Russia are lower than anywhere else that gas and oil is used as a major part of a budget. And so by some estimates, they can remain profitable even if the price of a barrel of crude drops to $15. So, so they're there for the long haul. Let's put it that way. They are behind in technology, artificial intelligence and hardware, data science, other innovation. However, they lead the world in investments in these areas as a per capita GDP. So, and both state funding and private sector funding in Russia is quite high. More importantly, they prioritize military uses of these technologies. So it's part of the military budget, which makes it socially more acceptable. I mean, the public accepts it more readily because it's part of the military budget. And more importantly, Russia uses their military technology, they test it rather, in places where they have military activity, like Syria. The United States isn't necessarily well known for testing out new technology in the battlefield. Russia is. And so, you know, new bombs, new automated systems, new autonomous vehicles, for example, they can be tested in real time. And that has been significant for Russia's progress in military. They have been successful in cyber attacks. So, you know, they're keen on knowing what we know and in doing what they want. And thus far, you know, we've only had limited success in blocking that. Theoretically, we also know what they know, but we don't necessarily know that for sure. I hope we know what they know. And most importantly, probably at the bottom there, Russia has overcome many of its demographic challenges. So in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union first broke up, into the first 20 years, I would say, they had low birth rates, they had high infant mortality, they had a declining life expectancy because of alcoholism, drug use, smoking. They had a disproportionate number of women to men because of wars. They had, you know, high crime rates, organized crime, other crime that had been suppressed under the Soviet system all of a sudden blew up. Most of those, the healthcare system has been mostly righted. They were before us in producing a vaccine for COVID, for example, and they have spread it widely. It is the traditional kind of COVID vaccine. It's not the, you know, the new kind like the Pfizer and Moderna, but it is a vaccine that has been, you know, 75, 80% effective, and they have shared it with their neighbors. One thing that Russia still has to pay attention to, they raised the age in 2018 for people to receive a pension when they retire. They raised the age beyond life expectancy. So that's a bit of a problem because, you know, if you die, you don't get to enjoy your pension at all. And there were huge protests of older people who were going to lose their pension or not get their pension in a couple months when they thought they would retire because the law changed. The law has not unchanged. People have simply accepted that they're not going to be able to do anything about it. So, so what's going to be the outcome of the Biden-Putin summit? They're going to muddle through. So they're both going to understand that each other is not a pushover. They're both going to understand that things are not really going to change in terms of cybersecurity, sanctions, military activities, nothing. But they are also both going to understand that their greatest challenges don't come from each other. Their greatest challenges come from their domestic audience. For Biden, his greatest challenges come from the United States, where right now we struggle getting anything passed in the House and in the Senate, especially in the Senate because of the close numbers. We have an angry population, maybe doesn't necessarily understand why they're angry, but it's all Biden's fault. And Biden will have to deal with those political realities at home. For Putin, he has his own political realities at home. People are very angry, and it's not being paid for by outside sources. They're angry at corruption. Young people are angry at not being able to get the kinds of jobs they want. They're angry at not being able to get paid the way they want. And they're angry that the government under Putin is becoming more corporatist. In other words, more restrictive on who gets to participate. And that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. So for both presidents, their domestic situation is going to need to be their primary focus. But don't forget, any leader worth his salt will use a little foreign policy endeavor to distract people from their domestic concerns. So in April, Putin sent thousands of troops to the border with Ukraine. Why? Not because he was going to start a war with Ukraine, but because he was demonstrating that it's still his prerogative for his people to take care of his neighborhood. His popularity shot up 7 points for that. Didn't even cross the border. So a little foreign policy can sometimes help your domestic situation, but it can't solve it. And so for both presidents, they'll have to deal with that separately. All right. Are there questions? Nobody asked a question.
Questions in the chat.
Do you have some, Barb?
I'll ask a question or two. I have this image of Putin as a FUD and of Biden as kind of a well-mannered, soft-spoken guy. How, my images may be wrong, but how will the different personalities affect what takes place?
That's a really good question. And, I'll make a prediction. You guys can, pay attention next week and tell me how wrong I am. But, Biden will come across as this senior statesman and a doddering old man. And Putin will come across as this healthy, taekwondo or judo or whatever, martial arts, powerful leader, and he'll put Biden in his place. Will he or won't he? Is that how it's going to play in Russia? Or is that how it's going to also play in the United States? So remember that Biden has met him on a number of occasions. Biden has strong foreign policy experience, but there is an age difference, and there is, I'm not sure I would call him a thug, but he certainly revels in his image as a strong man. And so, whereas Biden is the image of polite, gentleman behavior. And I don't know which of those will play better either in the United States or in Russia. Yeah, Robert?
Has Putin acknowledged culpability in the cyber attacks on the U.S. and elsewhere? And if he has he proposed to do anything about it?
He has not.
He has not.
No. And what he has said in the past is that it's not something he has ordered. He has no knowledge of it. And if there are those who are loyal to him taking his actions, those actions are their problem, not his.
I know nothing, right?
It benefits me, but I know nothing. And we are comfortable. Joan's got her hand up too.
Hey, Angela, just your thoughts on, I think what is being called the Havana syndrome. I recently, a couple weeks ago, read an article in New Yorker that talked about Biden's appetite being more willing to call out the Russians on this health anomaly called the Havana syndrome, whereby some of our diplomats in Cuba, but not just Cuba, some of our people going over to Russia, attending meetings, staying in various hotels, and then having these subsequent health issues with headaches, with disorientation. It was an interesting article that talked about a couple, they didn't name them by name, but a couple staffers leaving the White House who were overcome by these terrible symptoms. So do you think that our president has more of an appetite to pin this on Russia? And it is Russia. I mean, I firmly believe it is them. So your thoughts?
I think you've raised an important issue. I think Biden is willing to raise a number of pointed conversations with Putin. The problem with the subsonic, I think it's, or hypersonic, whatever the weapon that we're talking about, it's not universal. So you and I can go to Havana, you and I can go to Moscow, you and I can go to, Ukraine, and you have a reaction and I don't. Why? And so this is his plausible deniability again. Not everybody suffers these things. Are you sure they're not making it up? Is there some kind of area? So Biden will raise a number of issues of civil rights, human rights, political opportunities, political repression. But if you can't prove it, then it's harder to address it.
It would be interesting. I mean, if at some point they were able to somehow ID it and the vicinity from which it came, again, I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, maybe Biden has some ideas whereby we don't always have to play nice anymore. Because under the last administration, it was a different story.
Yeah. And, there's something to be said for positive relations. Absolutely. But there's also something to be said for standing your ground. And, so I think Biden is most definitely willing to be more aggressive in terms of pointing out these problems. But I don't know that he's going to be more aggressive in doing anything about them.
But it's a step, but I appreciate your keen insight because I think your bank of knowledge is great.
I'll ask
a couple questions.
Oh, go ahead.
Got a couple questions in chat from Greg Payne. Nuclear conflict has been avoided in large part due to mutual deterrence. Would large-scale cyber war be held at bay for the same reason?
For the first one, and that is one area that Biden will exploit with Putin, and Putin will exploit with Biden. Both of them are eager to get back to some kind of agreement on arms control. So that is an area that they will find some common ground, and they will work toward a common goal. As far as cyber warfare, it's not proportionate because the United States typically does not use the same tactics. We don't support, we don't use, like, our military doesn't invade and exploit, and we have rules against private companies doing it. If that changes and the United States decide that countries like Russia or China or other places are getting too aggressive with their cyber attacks, then we may choose to use cyber attacks as well. And then we will have to look towards some kind of agreement. I hope we don't get to that. The cyber attack on our food supply and on our fuel supply were a little bit frightening. So what if, you know, just by coincidence, even if they're all private actors, they hit power grids and water treatment facilities and, you know, gas supply, our fuel supply, and our food supply, our hospitals, where our vaccinations are stored. You know, what would happen if, you know, we have this mass storm? I think that some kind of agreement is coming globally. And I think that's the only way
What
it's
kind
going
of
to
a what is coming globally? I didn't catch that. Some
An
kind of a
agreement
what?
on cybersecurity, an agreement on prohibiting certain cyber attacks, and that individual countries will control their cyber, the entities that do cyber attacks. Like if the United States found some group that was attacking Russia, it would be in the best interest and important for the United States to arrest them, charge them, and throw them in jail, throw away the key. And that every country should be doing the same. So as we see bigger cyber attacks like the ones we've seen in the last few months, I think the global arena is headed toward a global cyber agreement of what will happen if that states should not be doing it, but that if entities within those states are found to be attacking and doing ransomware, et cetera, that they will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of laws everywhere.
Do you think Russia will be willing to be part of that global agreement?
I suspect that they'll start to be hit by cyber attacks. If not the United States, then it'll be others. So, and then they'll be a little more interested.
Got another question, good question in chat from Alan Dickey. Do you believe that Putin had some dirt on Donald Trump?
I do, but it's not the kind of dirt that maybe somebody else is thinking about. I think Putin had financial information about Trump. So some of the Trump organization's largest lenders were Russian oligarchs. And so I think financially speaking, the entities to which the Trump organization owed money were able to exert a little influence or a lot of influence on Putin, who then exerted it on Trump. That can be the case for any number of politicians in the United States. So, you know, do I think they had naughty pictures of him? No. But do I think that, you know, anytime that a politician has friends and allies from separate business than politics, that separate business can always blend over into politics. And that's why we have laws in our books and in our Constitution about that blending. So that's the kind of influence I think Putin had on Trump. Financial. The second one he has, what are the implications to end the Clear Skies Agreement between the United States and Russia? And, you know, I don't know. What are you referring to, Alan? If you can unmute yourself, that'd be fine. We'll come back to Alan.
Oh, no, I'm here.
Okay.
It just took me a second to turn off my mute. Okay,
Oh.
What I was referring to was the agreement that allowed planes to fly over and essentially take pictures of the other countries' installations of whatever they wanted to take. And so essentially the end of that means that we're no longer flying over Russia, and Russia is no longer flying reconnaissance flights over the US.
Is it imminent? Did you read that end was imminent?
Oh, say again?
I think that's a agreement that the Trump era wanted to end, but I don't think Biden wants to end it. Is it already ended?
No, actually, Biden wants to end it as well.
Oh, then I don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay. That's okay.
You know, for just on the surface, you would assume that we want to keep our secrets then, that we can do something that Russia won't know about, and Russia can do something that we won't know about. That is worrisome, but I have a feeling that we've already been doing things that Russia doesn't know about, and they've already been doing things that we don't know about. And with satellites, Flyovers become less significant because we can take satellite images. That's not to say that's not worrisome. Every time that we have an agreement that ends, it raises a new level of suspicion. But in this case, and again, this is just speculation because I haven't read about this, but I would say probably we're less concerned about it because of the satellite coverage that we have.
Yeah, maybe so. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Well, I'll ask one. President Biden has called Putin a killer. Has Putin responded to that? And what effect will that terminology have on this meeting?
It does set a certain tone rather than a friend and an ally with the previous administration. Biden is letting him know that Biden doesn't appreciate Putin in the same way that the former president did. The announcement or the decision to call him a killer referred to some of the assassinations that appear quite clearly to have been directed by the government of Russia. And the government of Russia cannot be separated from Putin. So he can say he didn't order it, that, you know, if it happened, if it was caused by somebody in the government of Russia, he didn't know about it. But there is very little that doesn't go on without either his explicit consent or his nod that this would be a good thing to do, and then somebody goes out and does it. So I think Biden is setting the stage that I'm not Trump. So we're going to return to not an adversarial position, but not a pushover position either. So.
Question from Robert Kapanji. Why did Navalny fly back to Russia after recovering from an attack on his life by Russia? I wonder that too. It seems to me to be akin to suicide by cop.
You know, that's a really interesting analogy because he was in Germany, he was free and clear, he was healthy again. But I think that Navalny has an attitude about his country that is actually quite similar to Putin's attitude about his country. Putin believes that the Russian society appreciates a strong man, and as long as he is taking care of most of their needs and demonstrating that Russia is strong in the world, his people will go along with him. Navalny wants to be that strong man. And so I think he believed that he could come back and continue to be this opposition figure and rally enough support to overthrow Putin in the next election. There's also a possibility that he wanted to be a martyr to the cause and may yet get his wish to do that.
He wanted to be, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
A martyr?
A martyr, okay.
Yeah. The problem is that this week, Putin's government has made all of those organizations related to Navalny illegal. And I'm sorry, the whole time I've been talking with the wrong microphone. So is that now? Oh, sorry. But sorry about that. Somebody should have yelled at me way sooner. But for Navalny, he would like to take over as the strongman. One of the dilemmas for Navalny is for the United States, we support him because he is a political figure who is being abused, repressed, and persecuted. He is not that great of a person, however, in terms of his politics. He is not that different than Putin, in fact. He is very Russian ethnic centric. So he is not a fan of any of the Southern peoples. He's not a fan of any of the non-Russians who expect to be treated like Russians in Russia. But so he would like to be a strongman of a different sort. What he is a figure that opposition can rally around. So I'll take the liberty of making the analogy in the United States. So a lot of people are angry. They're angry about jobs. They're angry about pay. They're angry about healthcare. They're angry about taxes, but they're not necessarily angry about the same thing. But when 2016 election rolled around, Donald Trump understood that anger and became the figure who could address it. And so all these very divergent groups rallied behind Trump to win the election in 2016. Navalny wants to be that for Russia. There's a lot of anger and frustration for a wide variety of reasons, and he wants to be that figure that the opposition will rally around so that he can be elected. So, and he can't be elected if he's in Germany. Well, in fact, he can't be elected anyway, because he had already been in prison and already declared ineligible to run. But I think he was hoping there would be enough momentum when he returned, you know, like Lazarus raising from the dead, that he would be able to rally enough support to win the next election.
That's great. I had not heard that, Angela. I learned something right there.
Yeah.
Okay, got a couple other questions in chat from Mac Pogue. Are there other oligarchs who aren't in favor of Putin? How many oligarchs are there currently in Russia?
There's a small circle of oligarchs. His closest inner circle maybe includes 20, 25 people. There's maybe, you know, like the top 100 people in Russia own, you know, 75 or 85% of everything. If they're not in favor of Putin, they don't last very long. So if it becomes clear that you are going to oppose something that Putin wants done, you better figure out where to hide your money in a Swiss bank account, and you better buy a plane ticket before you speak up. The most common treatment of oligarchs who disagree with Putin is to find them guilty of tax evasion and send them to prison and strip them of their wealth. So as long as Putin is not encroaching on your wealth too much, in fact, even better, if Putin is helping you build your wealth, Putin could do whatever he wants. This is that kleptocracy, another one of those political science terms. There is a growing problem with that, though, because the line between pleasing the oligarchs and pleasing the public is getting increasingly more thin. And for Putin, I mean, it's really a tightrope with a huge chasm below it. Theoretically, you know, the 10 or 12%, 15%, let's say, of the population who are oligarchs, really rich, versus the 85% of the masses. Quick poll, I should do a poll, but where do you think, which one would topple Putin first? The masses or the oligarchs?
Angela, question.
Wait, answer first. Which one do you think would topple Putin first, the oligarchs or the people?
I'm thinking the oligarchs, because they are made up of a cadre of individuals who absolutely love power and money. And my thinking is, should one of them have some sort of a set to or disagreement, as another professor has told us in a lecture, what's to say that, you know, Putin is not going to perhaps fall off the balcony? I mean, I'm thinking, you know, of the power vortex, and so many of them like that power for the sheer sake of power and money. It certainly could be in the cards. What do you think, Angela?
Well, and that leads into Dawn's question about is Putin grooming a successor? And the answer to that is no. Because one of the entities that is considered an oligarch are the generals, are the people who control the military. And so any coup, you know, something like, you know, 8 out of 10 coups that have occurred through history have been done by the inner circle. And that is certainly true in Russia, that the upper crust, which includes the military, are responsible for overthrowing the government. And so it's not going to come from the masses. It's going to come from the rich and powerful that he has frustrated and made angry. But that thin line, you know, of making those people happy, keeping those people happy, keeps him in power. But does that line shift when the people are more and more angry? And so that's a real good question.
Thank you for your insight.
Sure.
I wanted to ask about something that Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, said. He said Biden will warn Putin that unless his behavior changes, quote, there will be responses, quote. What responses does Biden have in mind, and what effect will that kind of a warning have on Putin?
Well, then we go back to the sanctions. The responses are really limited to sanctions. You know, it's unfortunate that Ukraine was invaded and Crimea was annexed by Russia. Not a single European or US troop went to help. We're not going to go to war with Russia. So what does that leave? That leaves sanctions. The challenge, of course, is that sanctions have a limited shelf life. You know, as Putin has pointed out, we've lived through sanctions before, bring it on, you know. So yes, Biden will make it clear that things have to change, that he needs to re-enter the polite society of global politics. For Putin, he's going to make sure that Biden knows that he's out of touch, that Biden is out of touch, that the polite society of the, you know, liberal international order is coming to an end as far as Putin is concerned. So this idea that liberal democracies are the best way to go for the world has been proven incorrect. Take China. It's definitely not a liberal democracy, and yet it is a tremendous economic powerhouse. And that's what Putin's response is going to be when Biden points out that he needs to get back into, you know, the loving hands of the European world, the liberal democratic world. So,
what kind of sanctions do you think might be effective?
You know, and they won't hurt the United States. They'll hurt Europe. Cutting off the pipelines. So many of the countries, including Germany, get a sizable chunk of their natural gas from Russia. Ending that, what's it called, the Nord Stream, so that it doesn't come online. But it's like any day, it's going to be fully operational and sending gas, and Germany's going to celebrate that. So the United States is going to have to convince Germany and the German people that they would be better off with cutting off that pipeline and teaching Russia a lesson than keeping natural gas flowing into Germany. Do you think that's going to sell? If I lived in Germany, it wouldn't sell to me. If the United States steps up its game and is able to ship liquefied natural gas, but that's still some time coming. It's coming, but it's not tomorrow. And that pipeline's pretty quick. So you know,
that's tough to threaten any meaningful sanctions.
It is. And you know, that's the limits of these kinds of relations. I think for my own prediction, my own hope is that the United States will re-enter strong alliances with our allies and rebuild some bruised feelings and some sense of unpredictability about the United States. The United States is a powerhouse, economic and military, and we must accept that we are a global leader, but we must lead with our allies and not drag them along behind us or trample them on the way to doing something. That's my personal view. And so I believe in the liberal international order, and I hope that we can restore some of that balance. It won't be the same, but it could be a new level of balance, a different level of balance going forward. So
Yeah, sounds
um,
good to me. Another good question. This is from Alan Dickey. It's a good question. What are the implications to Russia of the long-term trend of the world to use less oil?
they still have a huge supply of natural gas. So even though the United States and elsewhere are reducing our dependence on oil, we'll still use natural gas because it's a cleaner fossil fuel for some time to come. And they'll still command a presence because of natural gas. At some point, theoretically, we're going to go with, all renewables. That's sometime down the road. Maybe 2050 is some goal. Practically speaking, I think we're going to rely on fossil fuels for a really long time. And so Russia's still going to have a corner because it produces so much natural gas. I do want to answer Bob's here. He asks about a Romanov. There are actually descendants of the Romanovs. The problem with that is they fight amongst themselves over who is the legitimate heir to the Romanov line. So I don't think they could mount a serious challenge to any leader of Russia. They could get elected to the parliament or something like that, but I doubt that they would be able to rally enough support to get a serious challenger. And the NATO question that Wes asks is really quite pertinent. The countries that would most likely be invaded by Russia are the ones on the other side of Belarus. And it probably won't be Russia, it'll be Belarus. Poland and—
the question is, I don't know if everybody can see the chat, would we go to war if a
NATO country were invaded?
Sorry. NATO member.
The only 3 of the former Soviet republics that are part of NATO are Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And Estonia has actually had, in the early days, it had some challenges from Russia. And in fact, it was one of the last of the new members of NATO to have its Russian troops leave. So, but Poland right next door, some of the dissidents from the troubles in Belarus have fled to both Poland, especially Poland, and Estonia. And so, or even Lithuania for that matter, for any of them. And the flight that was detoured, for example, was leaving from Poland to the Baltics. And so is that an act of war to divert a commercial flight and redirect it to land in Minsk in Belarus? The answer apparently was no, but Russian troops nor Belarusian troops have crossed the border into a NATO country yet. It will be a big question if the NATO allies defend Poland, or if they defend one of the Baltic states. That is the agreement that we have signed with them. We expect them to come to our defense. They expect us to come to their defense. But would that mean then that the United States and our NATO allies would face Russia? So the expectation is that we will go to war to defend a NATO partner. But I think we'll think long and hard about it before we do.
Wow.
Did I miss any other ones?
Are there any other questions? We've got about 1 minute left. Otherwise, we can, I'd like to know how important you think this meeting is in the grand scheme of things.
In the grand scheme of things, it's another meeting. But I think in the Biden presidency, I think it's a really important meeting. It's an important meeting for him to step out and put his best foot forward and to let Putin know that things are different. How the domestic audiences perceive this will be key. And if it's a major flop for Biden, I mean, let's take H.W. Bush's trip to Japan when he had the flu. So, you know, does anybody remember what Bush talked about when he went to Japan and passed out on the floor? No. So what happens if Biden trips? You know, what happens if he, you know, says something incorrectly? That will be remembered. but don't expect any major like announcement or agreements or you know, some kind of reaction from this. But it's significant enough that Biden needs to put the United States back on sure footing with Russia. And that has implications for China, but that's another lecture for another day. So.
Well, if he has to put the US back on sure footing, he better not trip.
Right. But that's the only thing we'll remember if he does.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you very much, Angela. I will anticipate, I will pay closer attention to this meeting because of your insights. Thank you.